Picture this. Midnight settles over a medieval village, the fire long gone cold. 10 people sleep in a single room. Children tangled beside grandparents, a servant curled near the wall, a goat tied close to the hearth for warmth. In the dark, a husband reaches for his wife, slowly, carefully, silently. There are no walls to shield them, no bed sheets to hide beneath, just a pile of straw and the weight of knowing that everyone, awake or asleep, lives within arm's reach. So how did love survive in a world where privacy didn't exist? When the body still yearned, when desire grew louder than shame, where could intimacy go to hide? There were no bedrooms. In most medieval homes, even the word room implied a luxury. What we'd call a single room today was often the entire house, a cramped rectangle of timber and earth, or in the northern lands, a dark longhouse of stone and turf with a smoky fire pit glowing at its center and a hole in the roof for the fumes to escape. Inside lived everyone, parents, children, grandparents, maybe a cousin, a servant girl, even livestock brought in for heat. A bed, if one could call it that, was a shared mattress of straw laid across wooden slats, or sometimes the bare floor covered in coarse wool. No pillows, no partitions, no doors to close. According to 13th century land records, most English peasants lived in houses with only one heated space, open halls. Probate inventories describe a single bed for all as normal, not uncommon. Day and night blended into each other. A table used for meals became a bed at night. Children were wrapped in the same rough blankets as their parents. In the winter, families huddled together not out of affection, but out of the simple need to stay alive. Privacy was not merely scarce, it was impossible. Yet this was the world in which marriage existed, where love tried to breathe inside stale air and couples attempted to find tenderness in the dark. Marriage did not come with solitude, it came with company. Even after vows were spoken, the first night of marriage rarely promised seclusion. In some communities, it promised the opposite. Ceremonial bedding required witnesses to lead the couple to bed, not out of cruelty, but to confirm the union was real. For most, though, intimacy needed no ceremony, just courage and timing. Court records from 14th century Yorkshire describe a wife accused of lying with her husband behind the bread oven because her family home offered no other corner. In Essex, a servant testified that she heard her master and mistress every night, separated from her only by a thin cloth. Marital intimacy, expected and encouraged, had to be timed, muffled, or endured in silence. Parents waited until children slept. Couples waited for market days when the house emptied, or for nights when the room finally fell quiet. Others didn't wait at all. Church teachings demanded that the marriage debt be fulfilled, and so couples did what they could, blankets pulled high, voices low, and a mutual acceptance that nothing truly went unheard in one sense. Love was never alone, and in another, it was never free. When you couldn't build a wall, you hung a curtain. In homes where timber was scarce and stone stayed cold, fabric became the only barrier between the body and unwanted eyes. These weren't delicate veils, they were thick woolen drapes, patched and heavy, sometimes lined with fur, strung across beams or nailed into rafters. They didn't muffle sound, but they created the illusion of space. For couples, even a thin, swaying curtain meant something. A place to undress, to exchange whispers, to reach for each other without a dozen glances pressing in. By the 15th century, wealthier peasants listed bed curtains alongside pots, tools, and livestock, proof that privacy, however fragile, was worth recording. In towns, apprentices still shared cramped lofts, but the master and his wife claimed the only curtained bed. The four-poster, with heavy drapes on every side, became more than furniture. It was a room within a room, a warm little cave where breaths and touches belonged to two bodies instead of 10. Still, most families had far less. A single curtain over a corner. A blanket pinned to a beam. A screen woven from bundled reeds. It wasn't about shutting others out. It was about holding on to something of their own. In a world where space was shared, privacy was an invention, a craft shaped from scraps. Intimacy in the medieval home was never spontaneous. It was planned. Couples learned to read the pulse of the household. The moment the baby finally slept, the hour when the neighbor left for market, the hush that settled after the fire dimmed and footsteps drifted away. Silence became a tool, a language, a promise. Words were risky, but a glance across the room at dusk could carry the same weight. Small signals mattered. A shoe turned a certain way, a lantern placed nearer the door, tiny messages of readiness or warning. In households with servants, one might feign illness to thin the room. Others relied on chores to scatter the family, fetching water, tending livestock, gathering kindling. And in places with barns or bakehouses, couples stole brief escapes. A dark corner behind sacks of barley, a shadowed wall beside the coop. They weren't romantic settings. They were sanctuaries carved from necessity, stolen moments hidden inside the constant noise of life. Timing was everything. Winter brought early darkness and long nights. The house quieted sooner, breaths slowed, bodies settled, and in that narrow slice of stillness, couples found their chance. No doors, no locks, no private chambers. Yet somehow a flicker of solitude survived just long enough. In the realm of intimacy, class reshaped the world entirely. For the poor, the one-room house was the whole horizon. No spare chambers, no separate beds, no choices. Privacy was a dream. But for minor lords, merchants, and prosperous yeomen, privacy became a status symbol. By the late medieval period, some homes included a solar, an upper chamber set apart from the communal hall. There the lord and lady could retreat behind a door, a lock, even a chimney of their own, and perhaps for the first time feel a space where love could unfold without witnesses. Inventories from 14th century Kent list separate sleeping chambers with curtains, linen sheets, and small chests for private belongings. Meanwhile, the cotter and the villain still slept by the hearth beneath a thatched roof, their world condensed into a single smoky room where cradle, cooking pot, and marriage. Bed all touched the same walls. In monasteries and nunneries, intimacy was forbidden entirely, yet hidden corners and whispered confessionals reveal their own quiet stories. Even in castles, where nobles had rooms, servants, and heavy doors, privacy was never absolute. Walls were thin, servants listened, gossip traveled fast, and solitude could be bought but never guaranteed. A fire could warm a chamber, but only wealth could muffle the rest of the household. And when even curtains failed, people left the house. Many couples, especially the young or those not yet married, sought their moments where no one lived. In barns, bakehouses, or at the forest's edge. Places where the cold bit hard but no eyes followed. Church records tell of sins committed near the stables or behind the mill wall. Not tales of wickedness so much as tales of desperation. In some villages, night watchmen caught lovers in fields, under hedges, behind trees. Punishments followed. Fines, public shaming, sometimes a whipping. Yet the behavior continued, because what choice was there? For married couples, it wasn't sin at all. It was necessity. If the house was too crowded, too loud, too narrow to breathe, then love had to wander. Even if it meant mud, hay, or the sharp wind of early spring. A 15th century record from Norfolk describes a couple who lay together on a sack of wheat behind the granary door, while their house overflowed with guests. The details are plain and yet strangely heroic, because in a world designed against privacy, every act of closeness became an act of defiance. Medieval intimacy was never merely personal. It was monitored, regulated, judged. The church spoke endlessly of sex but rarely of affection. Within marriage, intimacy was allowed, even required, but primarily for procreation. Desire without the intent to conceive? Dangerous. Suspicious. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to ask couples whether they had embraced too fondly, kissed too eagerly, or spoken wanton words while others slept nearby. Guilt was measured not only by what was done, but by where it was done. The law added its own pressure. Fornication, adultery, even unseemly behavior could be brought before ecclesiastical courts, and these courts thrived on what neighbors overheard. In one Norwich case from 1442, a woman testified that a couple were joined after dark while her mother snored beside her. In another, a maid described hearing laughter and the soft thud of bodies behind a cloth partition. Homes had thin walls, boards creaked, and people listened, sometimes out of spite, sometimes out of boredom, but always listening. Intimacy was never solely between two people. It was a quiet rebellion against judgment, against shame, against the ever-present ear pressed to the timber wall. But in the end, the night offered something rare, not privacy, but mercy. When the candles burned out, when voices softened into sleep, when the cold settled over the rafters and the dark pressed close, the world finally forgot. In that stillness, couples found their slivers of tenderness. A hand searching for another beneath the blankets. A breath warming the hollow of a neck. Words whispered so gently even the mice beneath the straw could not hear them. No one saw. No one judged. Not the priest. Not the children. Perhaps not even God. These were not grand romances. They were small mercies, moments that made the long struggle worth bearing. A husband kissed his wife's fingers as frost gathered on the window. A mother reached across the straw for her partner, just to feel him there. In that quiet, love endured, not with fire or poetry, but with patience and the fragile grace of being allowed a moment unobserved. For once, the darkness kept its promise to cover rather than condemn. Privacy did not appear overnight. It crept in slowly, like warmth seeping through a cold stone wall. By the late 16th century, the change could be seen in the very blueprints of wealthier homes. The single-room dwelling divided into chambers, a hall for guests, a kitchen for work, a bedchamber for sleep, and sometimes even a withdrawing room designed for retreat. Architecture began to reflect intimacy. Walls rose not only for protection, but for quiet. In towns, houses reached upward. Sleeping spaces moved to upper floors. Fireplaces warmed bedrooms. Shutters thickened. Doors began to lock. For the poor, the shift was slower. Rural cottages remained crowded, but small transformations still appeared. Fabric partitions, corner beds, wooden screens, chimneys that thinned the smoke, brick replacing wattle, glass windows beginning to shut out the wind. With each new structure came a little more room for breath, a little more silence, and a little more space where intimacy could exist without shame or spectators. So how did couples find closeness in one-room homes? They didn't wait for privacy, they invented it. They carved out space with curtains and woven mats, with the cadence of daily chores, with glances that carried meaning across a crowded room. They held hands beneath blankets, whispered beneath the hum of sleeping bodies, and loved without doors, without distance, without the luxury of being alone. And somehow, despite the cold, the noise, the ever-present nearness of others, they loved deeply and quietly. Not other even when the world gave them no reason to stay, no place to hide, no room at all except the room they made in one another.